just super important to over disclose, and
It's insurance.
It's insurance. It's exactly right. Because you don't know what you don't know, and you can't forecast every foreseeable event in the future. And as long as you, with the best of intentions, laid out every possible scenario and had the parties sign, sign acknowledging that they understand that there's a lot of risk to this and that they should seek advice, then it's the CYA.
You don't have to answer this, but how have the investors fared?
Well, we did very well with our first one.
Was that like an apartment complex where you're selling the equity in order to satisfy the banks?
I tell you what it was is we bought a package of single-family rentals from a financial institution. This was back in the day when there was chaos before the Great Recession, and we had a lot of lenders approaching us with favorably priced assets, and we ended up acquiring a portfolio of single-family rentals. It was not unlike an apartment property, but it was all single-family rentals, and we didn't use any debt. We did it all cash, all equity, and the idea was that we would own it for about 5 years, enjoy the cash flow, improve the property, and then put debt on it at that time, and return capital, and have leverage and use leverage at a modest level to enhance return on cash and return on equity. And we never ended up putting debt on it. We ended up owning it for almost 10 years, and we decided that we had investors of every shape and size and phase in life, and I'll tell you, managing equity is sometimes harder than being responsible to your debt, being responsible to your bank.
Managing the equity shareholders.
Managing shareholders and managing their.
Something we've not talked about.
It's not easy. It's like customer service, and a lot of the investors were, high net worth people who were just super curious all the time about
We did talk about it, Ricky. I talked about ankle biters.
Yeah, there's a lot of ankle biters, but we love them, and but there's there's a deep responsibility, and we just found that as the holding period ended up being longer, but we were glad we waited because
You went through the 2008 crisis when everything plummeted, and you waited. You had to wait.
Yeah, well, we actually bought around that time.
Oh, good.
And
okay.
sold.
So you bought low and sold high.
Bought low and sold high, and we did. We also thought about maybe selling individual homes one by one, doing a dividend, and but all of that required communication with our shareholders, our equity, and documenting that, and we had an offering memorandum. It was a very simple offering memorandum. It wasn't anything sophisticated.
Did they get any distributions during their holding period?
They did. We had a preferred return structure where we, to the extent there was cash flow, we gave them the
5%?
We gave an 8% preferred return on cash flow, and probably was a little high at the time, but we.
I don't know. In 2010, 11, 12, there was some companies. Cottingham's going to be here soon. He can talk about one where they ran cash flow problems while they were trying to market the company. So they went to current investors and said, "Look, 14%." And of course, if you already got money in it, you think, well, am I going to throw bad money after good?
Yeah.
But some of the investors went ahead and bought those notes and got the 14% for a year.
Yeah.
And then after that, the company was sold for a profit.
That's fantastic. If you have confidence in the business and getting
confidence in Cottingham.
That's a great way. And we did pay a preferred return, and we wanted to do that because it was a demonstration that we knew as the steward of their money, we wanted them to know that their equity is more important than ours, and their priority in being paid back was number one and paramount. And we also had a little bit of what's called a waterfall provision that in the event of a sale, if we hit a certain return on capital, that we would participate over and above a certain number. I think that number was 12%. And as long as we hit 12 and they got a total return of their capital, then we would split the balance, a little bit like a private equity, but not quite as
The private equity tends to be 2 and 20, right?
2 and 20.
So
yeah.
2 and 20, I haven't done a 2 and 20 deal in a long time, but a 2 and 20, there's a 2% management fee per year of total assets that the venture capital is managing, or I guess the venture fund is managing. And then it's 20% of profits after investors have gotten a full return. So investors will get 80, manager will get 20. And those are really real common deals for that. I guess they still happen.
They do all the time, and they're incentive based for the sponsor. We as the sponsor of the deal, to go out and make sure we're providing a healthy return, that we're aggressively pursuing the highest return we can, and if we do that, we're rewarded over and above a very fair return that we give to them after they, it's not just a return on, it's a return of their principal.
And their 20% in the 2 and 20 deal is sometimes described as a carried interest. And when they get their 20%, how do you think they want it treated from the tax point of view, right? They want, and this has been all, this has been something Warren Sanders and a lot of other people talk about a lot. They want the 20% tax to capital gains rates, and which they are for all the other investors. But the argument is, well, this is your trade or business, that should be treated as income. So it's a big ongoing political debate involving trillions of dollars.
A lot at stake, and the difference between capital gains and ordinary income is a big number, and capital for the capital markets are super important to our economy and the free flow of capital, and I'm a big proponent of those who are wanting to lead those projects that have risks should be fairly compensated, so long as it's not unfair and that they're not taking on too much risk. And in any event,
do you use in your business? And I think this is something that benefits the entire class. In your business, now that you've taken off your lawyer hat and you put on the entrepreneurial hat, do you, for legal help, do you have your own tax accountants or tax lawyers, or do you have your own real estate lawyers, or you really don't need them? How does that work? Because now I've asked Chuck the same question.
That's a great question, and it was a long process for me to let go. Yeah. I always wanted to be, or frankly was asked, to be, hey, you're the lawyer, you mind drafting our organizational documents, or do you mind giving this a review? And over time, I realized that my skills and experience were suffering from a little bit of atrophy because I wasn't practicing all the time.
Some rust was setting in.
A little bit of rust, and things are changing, at a very rapid rate. But the big thing for me was it's about time and managing your time, and if you're focused on the business side and that's your primary responsibility, it's really hard to also try to be lawyer and take time to draft things, and it became hard to be both. And I finally realized that I can't be all things to all people, and learning how to say no, even though I am a lawyer, learning that I've got great friends who are lawyers who can be our vendors, so to speak. Sure. And since then, that probably happened over time, but it happened about 6 or 7 years ago, where I slowly, there were even times I can remember as recent as 5 years where there was an opportunity that came up, and they said, well, you're the lawyer, we'll let you earn 5%, or I may have proposed, hey, what if I'm the lawyer and I'll do all the organizational documents, I'll do all the legal work as part of the transaction, and I'll take a 5% equity stake, or whatever equity stake I can, and also put some of my own capital in. So I did do that. In fairness, and I guess that's probably why they kept asking me to be a lawyer. But I think just over time, I decided that it was a better use of my time, and there was better advice.
For taxes, do you use a tax accountant or use a tax lawyer?
I use a tax accountant.
I think most young businesses do, right? Yeah. Versus hiring a tax lawyer.
We have a few lawyers that we use, depending on the matter that we're involved with, real estate or business, but I have a great tax advisor. And listen, the more mistakes I've made in my career, the more I know how important it is to ask for help. And so I love I'm not afraid to spend a little nickel if you need to, because it's the best insurance policy ever to have great counsel. And we have great lawyer. You may know Ed Weinberg, who's helped us a ton, and he has a tax background, but he's just a good lawyer. And then we use Chip Ham a lot on our.
I love Chip. I might get Chip in.
He'd be fantastic.
You guys would love Chip.
He is
Ham,
fantastic.
He's the lawyer who still practices law pretty heavily, but he owns the Country Cow. And a couple of other restaurant chains, and he's just fun.
He'd be great. He and I we should have done it together, because we've been panelists together. He's my lawyer on. I've invested in a principal in a number of other businesses other than my core business in real estate, and he has a great food and bev. He was the Doc Crow's, and listen, there's no one more intelligent and more. He's a great one to have, and he's been a great help to me. We're good friends, but I'm on the phone with him all the time. He's now.
You did this and encourage him to do it when I call him.
I will definitely, because you all would really enjoy meeting him. But I've been involved with with Doc Crow's. Everybody knows Doc Crow's, and the Company Cow, which has gone through some challenges, and Chip has been front and center. Because he's a great guy, and he's the very honest guy. He's like the last man standing. The ship's going down, and he's still there trying to recapitalize things and find a source. And he's done great. Company Cow's rocking and rolling. I invested in some of the other restaurants that you may not have heard of.
Was Tumbleweed one of them or not?
The Tumbleweed property was a lease, a large lease that they undertook to do a Mexican concept, and it didn't last. And I was part of that investment.
Remember the guy on our Red Cross board who was like the Tumbleweed CEO? You remember him?
No.
Brian Queller brought him in.
No.
But he ended up leaving because the whole Tumbleweed operation was falling.
Tumbleweed went through a lot of evolution, but yeah, that was part of what happened. Doc Crow's is one of the most successful by itself. Was producing so much revenue. If they could have just duplicated, the benefit of hindsight's 20/20, but if they would have just duplicated that, and they
Tumbleweed on the river location.
Not at the Tumbleweed location.
Okay.
That's a little bit different. The Tumbleweed location, I feel like, is
It's a problem.
And then what they were trying to do, all these original, don't tell Chip I said this, they were trying to do all these original concepts all at once. And the complexity of that, there was just no standardization. There was creativity, and everybody was exuberant about it, but there was literally, you were doing something brand new every time. We did the same thing, I say they, we did the same thing in Nashville with a steak place called Union Commons, and what ended up happening is the Doc Crow's cash cow ended up supporting all these new ideas, and Chip, being Chip, found a way, his ingenuity and his commitment to his investors, he worked day and night to find a way to get everybody paid back, and he structured a deal where there was a group out of Nashville, a family office, a well-known family and a very wealthy family who had experience in the restaurant business, who loved Doc Crow's, and came in as a replacement equity, essentially. They recapitalized it, diluted some of the equity that stayed in, but paid some guys off at par. You got your money back, which is very rare in the restaurant business to get your money back. But
did he sell the steak place in the end?
He ended up closing that. That was part of the roll-up and sale to, essentially, the majority of the equity was sold to this new company because new capital was needed to pay off existing obligations from the mistakes and to fuel what I hope to be is a future for Doc Crow's in Cincinnati and other areas, because Doc Crow's does very well.
Ronnie has only one, so?
It's only one.
But you think it's scalable?
I do. And at the time they had a commitment to do one in Cincinnati, and they had a great location, but we were all spread too thin on these new ideas. And at the end of the day, though, there's always a way to find, a rescue. Don't give up. I've been an investor in a lot of deals where the principals left, and that's no fun either. Yeah.
I guess 2 questions.
Uh-huh.
Are you involved in their new? Because they bought or they opened something up next to Tom Crow's. It's like
No, the Bourbon Room. No, I'm not involved in that, but it is a really cool concept. They have over 100 different bourbons. It's really gonna be neat, and that's ground zero for Whiskey Row, and I don't know how much profit it'll make, but it's a great augmentation to what they have there, and I love the idea, and at least it's somewhat congruent with Doc Crow's and bourbon and the history of that area, and
I think it's starting to hit a critical mass.
I think it's going to do well.
And there's there's the Repeal restaurant there, which most people enjoy a lot.
I love
I don't know
Repeal.
whether, is that owned by the hotel or is that a separate business?
Repeal is part of the hotel,
Okay.
and
taco place behind.
yeah, what's it called? Oh gosh.
I can't remember.
Anyway, but yeah, that's the Moxie Hotel, and then
Right.
then
The Distill and the Moxie in the back.
Yeah, that's a Steve Poe development.
Okay.
I've invested in some of his hotel deals, a small bit of, and that got connected to Steve Poe through Ed Skis, who was a fellow law school classmate of mine, and his wife Jody is the CFO of a local, very prominent developer who does hotel development. He did the Aloft, he did Moxie, he did Distill, he's done a few others in town, and yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, so it's relationships.
All right.
I don't want to take too much time.
I guess you're out of time, but
Yeah.
thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you all. I really appreciate it. Thanks a ton for having me.
Sit through this guy's presentation.
I'd love to. If you all don't mind me sitting through, I'd love it. And thank you all for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Fred, is that they're going to be discussing buy-sell agreements.
Seen it.
So feel free to comment.
I will. Yeah.
Yeah, that's something else for us to talk about if we have dinner and drinks. Is this whole idea of the interlocking relationships among investors in this community and how you learn of things and you learn of them, and like in Sean's case, he's done it before, and they're usually these small windows, and how do you even find the window? And it's just fascinating.
It is.
Because the investments I found have done look like it's just showing up because you're in the right place at the right time.
That's relationships. You
Right.
know, you hear and you have your part of it's having your antennas up a little bit. You know, it's once you hear about it, you're like start asking.
Right.
All right, everyone. How are y'all?
Good.
Tough to follow him up. But this is Adam Hibbets. I'm Dimitri Johnson, Cantu, and we're doing buy-sell agreements today. So we're going to start with what are buy-sell agreements, and read a few things on them. It's basically a contract to buy and sell personal property. For a lot of different events trigger that, and I have a slide on that later. But so when a particular event occurs, it's like termination or a shareholder wants to withdraw or death, etc. So this is something that we thought was interesting. They can be separate contracts, but read something out of California that said that the buy-sell agreements could be in the corporation's articles or bylaws, but a better benefit, or you get more benefit for having a separate contract.
Separate shareholders agreement.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. So what is the purpose of buy-sell agreement? I kind of liked this. I saw some different definitions and things, but I kind of like this. So the purpose of the purpose of the buy-sell agreement was to provide for the purchase of the interest in the corporation of a shareholder who has died or wishes to dispose of their shares, and prevent shares of the corporation being freely transferable. So it kind of just keeps it all together with the shareholders when someone leaves for many different reasons or any different reasons.
They leave to go work for your competitor. You don't want them owning equity in your business any longer.
Exactly. And then here's a good purpose. I thought this was great. Was so to permit the original owners of the business to retain control over the identity of their associates. It really just drove the point to me. Like they want to stay knowing who works in there or who the shareholders are, to keep it kind of tight and together, and not just have it everywhere. If someone got divorced, and now you have somebody's spouse or somebody died. It also allows shareholders to dispose of their interests in a corporation that has no ready market. We talked about that a bit.
Yeah.
We had a case. It was a shareholder passed away. The spouse wanted to take the shares and kind of cash out and just change the assets into something that she could do more with and have control over. And so that was just one case that I didn't really put in there, but yeah, in case of a deceased shareholder's estate. So that's one example. So what do buy-sell agreements include? This is kind of just 4 points that they said a well-drawn buy-sell agreement will have. It'll limit the class of potential shareholders in the closed corporation. It'll provide liquidity for the estate of a deceased shareholder. It'll establish a fair value for shares that otherwise have no ready market, which we'll get to later, and it will provide for funds with which to purchase shares of a retiring, withdrawing, or deceased shareholder. A world without a buy-sell agreement. So if there are no buy-sell agreements, if there's no prior agreement, then the sale of the shares depends on two things. The sale of the shares to the other shareholders at a fair price at the time depends on 2 points. The financial preparedness of the other shareholders to buy and pay for the shares, and the negotiating ability of the executor, administrator, or surviving spouse. So really, it's just easier to have this all set at the beginning. When something happens,
And there's no requirement otherwise that anybody buy the shares. You could find, the estate could find itself owning a illiquid 10% of the company on which dividends are never paid.
So what conditions are frequently used to trigger this? Like when would this come into effect? Shareholders' death, retirement, which we kind of talked about, resignation or other termination of employment, bankruptcy, incompetency, divorce. And this was kind of a violation of the buy-sell agreement contract. I don't know if you guys can see that, but it's just someone tried to transfer their interest in like an invalid way that was like kind of was a violation of the contract. So then we would look at the buy-sell agreement, kind of see how to get rid of their shares. So there's 3 main types from my research of buy-sell agreements. There's the entity purchase agreement, which goes by a lot of different names. Stock retirement agreement was something that I saw, or stock redemption agreement. Also stock purchase agreement was a different name for that. Cross purchase agreement, I guess I saw it as people call it buy-sell agreement, but that's the only name that I really saw it come up as. And then there'd be different combinations of these two, so some people call it hybrid agreement. So then we're gonna go through each one of those. An entity purchase agreement usually gives the corporation the option to purchase the shares of any shareholder who wants to kind of sell their shares in the corporation, and on death of a shareholder requires the corporation to purchase the decedent shares in the corporation. So in sum, the corporation itself is obligated to buy the shares or to purchase shares of the withdrawing or deceased shareholder, and not the other shareholders that are left over. So the corporation's buying the shares, and that works out in a couple ways. So here are the advantages. It's just a little bit simpler and cleaner, especially if insurance. Oh, that's the second point. I'm sorry. This is typically a cleaner agreement, though it could say, than a cross-purchase type of agreement, because the cross-purchase agreement may be rewritten at death like multiple times, mainly because insurance things. So here, each shareholder has only one contract, and that's with the corporation. But here, which you'll see later, the cross-purchase is mainly like, instead of one with the corporation, so if we were all together, we'd all kind of be tied together in it. So if someone went out, but instead it's just him and the corporation are kind of the entity in this one. So when funded with insurance, this is better or a little bit less messy because there's fewer insurance policies, and I'll kind of get to that later as well. But fewer insurance policies are required than with the cross-purchase agreement. So in this, you'll only have one insurance policy for each shareholder, and the corporation is the beneficiary. And it's easier to transfer the insurance policies at death because the corporation again owns the policy. Okay, so there's a lot more meat in this, but we kind of cut it out because I thought it would take too much time. But another advantage was in other agreements, there's like you get double taxed, and so with this one, you kind of avoid that. So it prevents double taxation of the corporate income used to purchase the shares of an existing shareholder. It's kind of deeper into the tax things, so I didn't really put all that in there, and Adam's going to talk to that a little bit more. The corporation, another advantage is that the corporation cannot take an income tax deduction for the amount it pays to purchase the shares. We need that. But the last one is kind of important, and so the corporation pays no income tax, or no, the other shareholders pay no income tax on the amount paid by the corporation for the existing shareholders. So their interest, so the remaining stock shareholders' interest increases, and then I'm just gonna read it. I'm sorry.
That's all right.
The proportionate interest of each of the remaining shareholders in the corporation is increased. So they get more when the corporation buys the shares back from.
Yeah, everybody sort of needs to follow that. If there are 4 shareholders and they're all working for the company, and you buy one out, then obviously 25% goes to 33 and 30% for each of the remaining people. So they have an advantage. They don't get any distributions, well, they'll get a 33 and 30% distribution going forward if dividends are declared, but they actually own more equity as a result of the buyout.
Yes, sir. Yeah. So that's what I'm trying to say. And so, but then they don't have to pay income taxes on that amount.
That gain.
Yes, sir. Yeah. So that's an advantage of this type of agreement. A disadvantage is that the contract may be unenforceable by the time the purchase is required. It's kind of a tax thing. So, and I think he's more in the weeds on that one in the later slides. Another disadvantage is there's accumulated earnings tax and that the insurance premiums, this is what I read, that the insurance premiums paid by the corporation are not always deductible with this type of agreement.
And it largely turns on whether, and this is just remembering from practice years ago, it largely turns on who the actual owner of the policy is as well, right? Not only who pays the premiums, but who owns the policy.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
I think if the corporation owns the policy and pays the insurance premiums, it can deduct premiums. That's my recollection.
Okay.
But you know, when the first deal I ever did like this, and it's not an area I wanted to deal with, but I had to deal with it. So I called a guy with one of the big local insurance companies. And they had forms out of the gazoo. He knew exactly how to, sell the insurance to the corporation and all the structures necessary to protect everybody's interest.
Yeah, because there's a lot.
It's very common.
So we did disadvantage cross-purchase agreement. So this was the second type of buy-sell agreement. So this one's kind of the opposite, or well, not the opposite, but instead of one shareholder in the corporation being the main people communicating, now say we're all in it together. So if there's insurance involved, so if there's 4 people, there'll be 12 insurance policies because you have to get it on each other shareholder. So it's kind of confusing, but so
It's easiest when there are 2. Yeah.
Yeah.
But
So-
you could have a buy-sell and a cross-purchase agreement at the same time.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
So basically, it's just contracts among shareholders of the corporation. Instead, before it was different. This requires, upon the occurrence of certain specified events, just like before, which we went over the specified events, the other parties, so this is a big difference, the other parties to the contract have the right or obligation to purchase a shareholder's shares, and they do that for a price that's in the contract. So essentially, this is basically the in sum, the remaining shareholders of the corporation will not, as individuals and not as a corporation, purchase at issue, so the exiting shares, so the exiting shareholder shares in the corporation. So the advantages of cross-purchase agreement, it raises fewer income tax problems than other agreements. Basically, the agreement before, there's fewer income tax problems. It avoids redemption rules that subject a stock sale to dividend treatment. It avoids tax issues arising from a share redemption, corporate alternative minimum tax, and corporate accumulated tax earnings. So we saw one disadvantage of the entity purchase agreement was the accumulated earnings tax. I'm going to skip the last point.
All that's doing is creating issues, right? You're not suggesting outcomes, but do you know what's meant by redemption in this context? All right, so if a corporation buys shares from any of its shareholders, it can be a disproportionate redemption. So it buys 0 shares from 3 shareholders and all the shares of the 4th. It's still called a redemption because the corporation's actually buying out one of its shareholders. And what's happening as a result of that is going to be a distribution of corporate assets out of the corporate box into that individual shareholder. He turns over his share certificate, the corporation hands him cash. That's a distribution, and it's governed by the Kentucky Business Corporation Act. And if that distribution would render the company insolvent, dividends are also distribution, but in this case you got a distribution through a redemption. If that would render the company technically insolvent, the directors are liable for the amount of the payment individually. So the whole point I'm making is that a redemption is whenever a stock is bought back by the corporation, and it's also deemed a distribution. So you run into the insolvency rules. So you always have to, because it's hard to remember for most lawyers that they can see where a dividend or a return of capital would be a distribution, but they have a hard time grasping. You mean if the corporation buys the guy's stock, but that's also a distribution requiring an insolvency determination. Just a point. Go ahead.
So this is potential advantage if the agreement is funded by insurance, and there's a large difference in the ages of the shareholders or how much, basically because of premiums, like an older shareholder may have a larger premium. So if I bought a policy on you and you're a lot older than me, it may make me pay more for premium, or if you all owned a different percentage of the corporation, there may be different premiums. So this may have advantages. There's different factors that go into that. The disadvantages. So from my reading, they said it was kind of administratively cumbersome, so you had to do a lot more stuff most of the time, and its costs are often not evenly shared among the shareholders. That's kind of what I was going with the premiums. If the cross purchase is funded with insurance, the number of insurance policies and related premium expenses rise. If there are more than 2 shareholders, so like you said, the perfect number is 2. 4 shareholders need 12 different life insurance policies. So 3 need 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 6. Younger shareholders have higher premiums on the lives of the older shareholders. Yeah, we talked about that with the premiums with insurance. Reliance on other shareholders. So with this also, if it's funded by insurance, you have to rely on the other shareholder to make sure that they're keeping up the policies, that they're doing these things right and paying the premiums and all of that. So with the entity purchase, you really didn't have to rely on anyone else. It was you and the corporation paying for that.
There are people who, based on your research, there are people who actually use, I don't know, 12 different life insurance policies to fund cross-purchase agreements. I never saw that practicing law.
This again was about the cash surrender values. So the cash surrender value of the insurance policies are not subject to the claims of the corporation creditors, so that was an advantage, but they are subject to shareholders who own the insurance policy, or to, I think it meant creditors of the shareholders' insurance policy. But
Okay, but you think people are using whole life insurance, they're using term life? Everybody understand there's a term life and whole life? You know, okay, so just real quickly, some know, some don't, but a term policy is straight out insurance. So if I pay $20 a month for $10,000 worth of term insurance, I don't build up any equity in that policy. If I die, somebody gets the $10,000. But in the meantime, I can't sell anything. I can't go say, well, I'd like the insurance company to buy me out, because they haven't done anything to insure my life. It's simply a risk analysis. Whereas with whole life, you could actually, part goes for insurance to pay your spouse or your partner. The other part is invested and builds up value. So we call that value the surrender value of the policy. So you actually would have equity in your insurance policy. And I don't know many people anymore who buy whole life. Do you, Fred?
No, but I know that our North American Mutual people are out still selling it. So some do as a way to augment what they're doing, investing.
That's Dan.
Dan.
Yeah.
Dan. Don't
Got
tell
him,
him.
Dan Rivers.
They're like the
and
Navy
he's very
SEALs.
good at what he does. But I mean, I went to, this is really a general business advice class. So when I finished law school, I went to my uncle, who was my great uncle, who was involved in forming a company called Liberty National Life Insurance, which later became Torchmark. And I said, "You're the insurance guy." And he says, "You don't need to buy it." I said, why not? He says, "Well, because you're paying X. If you're paying $200 a month, $20 is going to insure your life for the beneficiary, for the benefit of your spouse or children. The other 80% is allowing us to invest the money in equity projects around the world, and we're going to promise you basically a 4% return going forward." Now, if you're totally an undisciplined slob and you'll never take any effort to protect yourself in retirement, then yeah, it's sort of a forced savings plan.
Right.
It's not a good deal, but it's a forced savings plan.
That's
So they still exist, but so I said, okay, well, I was going to spend $200 a month, now I'm going to spend $20. So it was cheaper to buy term life insurance.
Doesn't term also stop after a certain age? Like however long the agreement is for, whereas whole life is for
Yeah, it often will be only for 10 years or 20 years. That's why it's called term life, right? And here, if you're an employee of the university, they pay your premiums for a certain amount of life insurance, a certain amount of term life, as long as you're employed by the university. Once you leave, the term is over. Yeah. And a lot of companies do that with their employees, right? Provide that as an employment benefit.
This is the third type of agreement, hybrid agreement. So it integrates the characteristics of both the redemption, which is the entity purchase you saw earlier, and the cross purchase agreements. It's a contract among the corporation and all or a portion of the shareholders. So before, the first one was just contract with the corporation, the second one was with the shareholders, this one is both. Either the corporation or the other shareholders will have the right to purchase the shareholders' shares.
Yeah. Thank you. All right. So the right of first refusal, I thought, was more of like the most basic form of a hybrid agreement, and it basically works like MBA restricted free agency. You have a third party come in, make an offer to buy stock, and the corporation has the right to refuse the deal. So they can just jump in and match the offer, take it from them, and purchase the stock that way. And I guess it's more thought of the right of first refusal is because there are problems with exercising the option to refuse and purchase the stock. So in Delaware, you have to exercise your right of first refusal within a reasonable amount of time. And in Kentucky, that is, there's no reasonableness requirement, but generally, when these are written up, don't they just normally just pick a time period?
Yeah, usually, and you're going to say the corporation will have 20 days or 30 days to match.
Yeah. And then I guess in Delaware, they're just like, I get it when you get there, you know.
So these are advantages that I researched. Hybrid agreement provides the shareholders with an opportunity to weigh the tax and other consequences at the time of the triggering event, whether it's death, divorce, etc. And then this gives the parties the ability to determine the best means for purchasing the shares at the time of the purchase. Also, the disadvantages. So if you get a bunch of shareholders that don't agree, can't come to a conclusion at the beginning when you're trying to write the contract, they don't agree, then an agreement, so then this may be converted to a cross-purchase agreement. And also they said the flexibility of it made it harder to use insurance to fund the purchase of shares in case of a deceased shareholder or just an exiting shareholder. So it made it harder because it was so flexible. When determining price, kind of value in this, we saw that there were 5 common methods: book value, formulas, mutual agreement, review periodically, appraisal or arbitration, and then a mixture of the other 4 methods. So with book value, I really only saw disadvantages, but I know there are some advantages because it's used a lot. But it just seemed like people talk, or the article spoke about like the language wasn't really set, and so you had to look at the agreement and
a lot of these agreements will say book value. They'll define book value to mean the net asset value as of a certain date is prepared by our accountants in accordance with generally accepted accounting principles. But book value is sometimes pretty decent, or some sort of adjusted book value, because then you can add inflation to the values if you want to. You can sort of restate book value. You can say restated book value and then define restated book value to include actual value as opposed to the cost, which is how they're usually booked on a balance sheet.
It's pretty common to add back depreciation. I figure everyone wants
You can
that.
add back depreciation, you can add appreciation, depending on how it's structured. But book value is usually okay for an asset-based business, but for a business like his, it may or may not be good. You know, businesses that provide a lot of services don't typically have, you have a big asset base, but if you're an accounting firm, I mean, there's not a lot of, you might have 20 offices, but they're rented, yet the going value of your firm is much greater than its assets. So then you wouldn't want to use book, or you'd want to say the price shall be 10 times book divided by the number of shares outstanding.
Yeah, and so book was really entangled in the accounting of the business.
That's how your values.
Okay, so appraisal or arbitration formula, sometime used to value the shares of a withdrawing or, so basically just a withdrawing.
More expensive process though, right?
Yes, sir, yes, sir. And I think that's what a lot of people use, other ones.
Yeah.
Deceased shareholder, so withdrawing your deceased shareholder, and you have them appraised by multiple appraisers, and then consistent with assets. You can kind of skip that for a second.
Okay.
They still have the Master Appraisal Institute. Is that still MAI?
Oh, yeah.
Okay,
So, yeah.
we used to deem that made as instructed. The MAI stood for, actually it's the Master Appraisals Institute, but we'd say made as instructed because valuation, as you've come to learn in this class, is educated guesswork. So
Sure.
you'd always have these competing, they're just completely opposite number. One company, and depending on whether you're on the buy or sell side, it's $1 million or 10 million. You know.
Hey, didn't somebody come in and talk about that, or was that might have been you?
We've talked about it.
Okay. Another popular one, formulas especially, maybe one of the more popular formulas would be percentage of earnings. If you don't know what earnings are, that's basically just net income. You deduct your cost of goods sold, your expenses, and your losses, and that's what you end up with. I think it's like a little bit more useful for a larger company. Where they might have just they're stagnant or they have a downturn and they need to hire a new CEO. They throw out the current CEO and they want to get someone who's well known and good for reviving companies, and they don't have a high number of stock left that's not outstanding or a percentage, or they just don't have enough to offer. So instead they put in the buy sell that they will buy it back when the agreement terminates, and then they'll give you a percentage of the earnings on a certain period. I couldn't find how long like the period would be. You know, if it's like
I've never
how
seen
many
this
years?
before. Where the buyback, you can use it as a formula. You can say, all right, if you leave for any reason within 3 years, unless we terminate, if you leave, at will at any point in the next 3 years, then we have the obligation to buy your stock back at a value equal to 5 times earnings per share. So the CEO gives you his or her shares back, and you give them a price based on an earnings-based formula.
Okay.
Yeah, that happens.
Okay. It was in a lot of stuff for like percentage of earnings. I don't know.
It's sometimes it's part of a liquidated damages provision in employment contract.
Another I guess one of the more common things would be death transfers. And you don't want to punish the families of these deceased employees, and the way that you punish them is you mess up the 2703B exception test. And basically, if you don't meet that test, they won't take the value of the agreement for federal, state, and gift tax, and they'll make it the fair market value the IRS feels like it is. And that's pretty much your disaster. Is you don't meet the requirements to be set, and then the IRS thinks the full market value is much higher than what they actually pay.
Yeah, but it's going to be a pretty big estate right before that becomes an issue.
Well, those are the people you want to work for.
That's a good point. So
So
2703, you're going to tell us how that works.
yeah, it's a special valuation rule just for federal, state, and gift tax. And subsection A sets the general rule that unless the agreement meets the exception test of the subsection B, the agreement's disregarded and they won't accept the value for that purpose. And 2703 was enacted not to replace the existing case law, but to supplement it. And there's some additional requirements, and I have no idea why they just didn't list them in the statute. But most of them are just rephrased versions of the statute, but there's little pieces they leave out. And 2703 is considered to be a safe harbor provision, which would just be the right way to phrase it. It's like if you make a good faith effort, it's generally accepted that it would meet the exception.
Are you saying here that if my proverbial rich uncle dies, but at the time he's got a contract with his company for his company to buy his stock back for 50% of book value,
Yeah.
or an asset. At that point, will the IRS then come in and say, sorry, that he's actually, the estate's going to have to pay tax not on what the company paid, but on the actual value of that stock at the time of death, even though the estate never gets more than 50% of book?
I guess the requirement that throws most of the people out when I get to it in a minute is you can't use a substitute for a will. And it's full and adequate considerations, and that even gets more weirdly defined, and it's more like if people at an arm's length transaction, which means you've hired counsel, you've done research, and they wouldn't, if reasonable minds wouldn't agree to a deal like that, they wouldn't call it full consideration. They say it's basically a substitute for a will.
Okay.
Especially with an uncle like that. So the prior case law kind of rules are it's got to be the right to buy a fixed amount of stocks, and the price has to be determinable from within the agreement. It's got to be legally binding on all parties during life and at death. And one that trips people up, and the whole reason 2703 I guess really exists, is there's been a long-standing thing that it can't be a testamentary device, so that you can't cheat the estate tax system, and families with I guess a lot of business background try to sell stock off to their nephews or son or whatever at a much lower value than what it's worth, so the estate tax would be a lot lower.
Right. Well said.
27, this is just the actual text of subsection A. I don't think I've really said anything that's not in there. B is the exception test, and it's got to be a bona fide business agreement in that it can't be a device to transfer such property to members of the decedent's family for less than full and adequate consideration in money or money's worth. So they tried to explain the whole can't be a will type deal, and the test is just, there's so many words in there that thousands upon thousands of dollars of litigation.
Well, except for 2703, it would be a great device, right? I mean, you could have your rich father put his 10 million, or let's say in this case 25 million, into a corporation. He takes the stock back, but at the same time gives options to each of his children, or gives purchase options to each of his children to buy it.
Use unadjusted book value, and you'll significantly underpay. And the third one is the terms are comparable to similar arrangements entered into by persons in arm's length transactions. The second and third elements, when tax courts analyze this, they kind of mesh them together. But the bona fide business arrangement is the easiest part, and you just have to have it's got to further some business purpose. And you do not have to be actively participate in management. For estate tax purposes, you can just hold it as an investment asset. B2 and B3, gives not a testamentary device, tries to explain it. And some of the things the tax court has said about this provision and trying to explain it is a fixed price for a minority stock interest, the value of which was otherwise uncertain and subject to substantial litigation hazards. Yeah, that doesn't really help you, but they really enjoy that. Because the IRS is just going to argue that, it was pretty certain and they just lowballed you. And another version they've said of this is the phrase is best interpreted as requiring a price that is not lower than which would be agreed upon by a person with adverse interests dealing at arm's length. And I would say that's probably the best way. That's made the most sense to me. Is that if two people that didn't know each other were making this same deal, instead of it being family, would they still, would reasonable minds still put the offer out there and then also accept it? And then for formula prices, they look at a lot more stingently, and I've seen, that's probably the thing I saw that got kicked out the most is formula prices. And they got to bear a reasonable relationship to the unrestricted fair market value of the stock in question. Basically what they'll do is they'll come up with their number for fair market value and say, well, how much of a percentage discount did this person get? And if the percentage is too high and they don't have like a strict threshold, then it'll get kicked out. Stock restrictions, traditionally they didn't exist. There were no corporate statutes. And so you went to common law rules for property, and it goes to restraints on alienation. And, the importance that has been placed on protecting the free transferability of corporate stock. The court strictly construed restrictions on transfer and invalidated restrictions that were found to be unreasonable in any respect, particularly absolute restrictions on transfer. And eventually we get to the 50s and we get to Taylor's and Minister versus Taylor, a case that went before the Kentucky Court of Appeals, that even without statutory authority, a transfer restriction is enforceable if it's reasonable and shares have been accepted with the knowledge of the restriction. They just have to, it can be on the front or the back, generally, the stock certificates, in the agreement. They just have to know what they're signing up for. And I believe the restriction in that case was
First refusal.
First refusal. And then in the absence of a controlling statute, it's just reasonableness. And, it's you got to have a sufficiently good reason to restrain these people for alienation purposes. And then some of the factors they've used, they're all pretty there's not really one you can really point to and say, well, that's going to really decide it. There's all these factors. It's really complicated. And so they eventually just keep the reasonableness requirement and enact KRS 271B.6270, which has got to be the worst number for a statute I've ever seen. And subsection 1 of that allows for restrictions on transfer registration of shares, and it's just the restrictions have to be, they can't affect shares that were issued before the restriction was adopted unless the shareholders are parties to the restriction agreement or voted for the restriction. A restriction, the subsection 2 is a restriction on the transfer or registration of transfers of shares. They shall be valid and enforceable against the holder if the restriction is authorized by this section. And all the authorizations are 3 and 4. The holder has actual knowledge, which was part of Taylor's Minister, and it goes on to 3, which is where they codified in the statute certain things that authorized to be reasonable. And that's to maintain the corporate status when it's dependent on the number or identity of shareholders. I guess you'd get into some S-class restrictions.
Sub-S, you can't have more than 100 shareholders.
Yeah. And then B's very similar to preserve exemptions under federal state securities law, like the Kentucky LLC rule that they all have to be actively engaged in management. 501D, I believe, is that right? And then C is, if it's equity-based compensation, restrictions about that are fine. And then D just codifies into any reasonableness purpose that Taylor's administered through it. So then you get 4, and 4 allows for reasonableness to obligate people to do things. And 4A, obligate the shareholder first. That's right of first refusal. B is to obligate people to separately, consecutively, or simultaneously to acquire the transfer of restricted shares. I couldn't find. Which one would you say is the most common? Separately, consecutively, or like a simultaneous?
The first refusal where you offer it to the corporation, if the corporation is unwilling to or cannot legally oblige, then it then gets offered to each of the remaining shareholders at the same price, and often the richest shareholder ends up getting the best deal because the other shareholders follow waiting. Whatever's left, it's a complicated phrase you see in the buy-sell, in the transfer restrictions, but basically each shareholder who doesn't participate, well, his right is a portion among the remaining in accordance with their equity portion of the company. So probably the offer the corporation first, and then to the shareholders as a group, and then separately.
Okay. D requires the corporation that holders of any class of shares to approve the transfer of restricted shares. I guess that's just giving someone a veto button, and
In common law, that was manifestly unreasonable, and this statute changed that. And the last one was absolutely manifestly unreasonable. In common law.
Yeah, and then subsection E just allows to prohibit the transfer of restricted shares to designated persons or class of person if it's not manifestly reasonable, as you said. And then, payments, you can be paid in any way, shape, or form, from life insurance, payouts to cash, transfer of assets, and also this secured promissory notes. And you can also do a pledge, as they said earlier. And then if a party neglects its duties under the buy-sell agreement, issues generally turn upon contract interpretation and whether or not the breach was material. And I believe that wraps us up. Thanks so much for staying over time, guys.
Thorough job, thank you. Are you going to get a copy of your slides to the students?
Yes, sir. We couldn't get them to print off.
Okay.
Every time I tried to print it off, it just crashed PowerPoint.
Can you send it as an attachment to the members of the class?
Yeah. Yes, sir. No problem.
And send me the attachment. Thank you.
Good job.
A little refresher course on buy-sell agreement.
Forgotten everything.
Yeah, he did a pretty deep drill on the state and gift tax ramifications we dive long ago.
Nice job.
Thanks,
Good
sir.
job.
We tried. No problem. Are you going to the gym?
No, I already went today.
You're good.
Yes. My mark is
Thanks, sir.
yes,
You want to walk home?
Yeah.
All right.
Good work, Fred.
Once a week is there, right? Rotation on. I'm good, how are you?
Good, good. I'm taking a drafting class. Yeah, so I like it. Hey, it works. Okay, I'm with you. See you. Oh, hey, how you doing? Getting on down, bro. Dude. semester. Freshman semester. Sheesh. Look at that. Dude, you killed it. You were like the banana and the cherry on top of the sundae. With green. I appreciate it.